Mother Fam, and how is everyone doing today? I hope that you all got into some good trouble this week. I know there were a lot of events happening in the Valley yesterday. I recently have been going to some different trainings, and there was a training that I was able to attend just part time, and they brought up the idea of nonviolent noncompliance during the rise of a fascist regime. So I just thought that was a really interesting concept. So if you're wondering what nonviolence, noncompliance might look like, for some people that might be creating art. You might have noticed a lot of really incredible art, which is beautiful, but also kind of a bad sign, right? Historically speaking. It could be developing mutual aid apps, right? Where we can let folks know what's happening in their own neighborhoods and if somebody needs assistance. It could be showing up as an observer when the secret police show up in our neighborhoods. And that is what they are, because we don't know who these people are. We don't even know if they're actually police. It could be providing a safe space for vulnerable neighbors, or it could even just be changing your purchasing habits. So I've canceled some of my subscriptions. I've stopped as much as I'm able supporting billionaires and oligarchs. So go ahead and put it in the chat and let us know how you are non-violently non-complying. But be careful, don't get yourself in trouble, okay? So I'm really excited for everybody being here today, as we have special guest, Dr. Yii Jan Lin. She is a PhD associate professor of the New Testament at Yale Divinity School. She is going to be discussing her book, Immigration and Apocalypse, how the book of Revelation shaped American immigration. She is also an associate professor. I'm sorry, I accidentally copied and pasted twice. So let me get this right. She's also the author of The Erotic Life of Manuscripts, New Testament Textual Criticism, and the Biological Sciences. Her research focuses on immigration, textual criticism, the revelation of John, race, and gender. Did I miss anything in your bio? That's a pretty impressive bio, Dr. Lin.
Thank you. Not at all. That's fine.
Great. So I'm just going to go ahead and hand it off to you, and I will monitor the chat, like I said, and I'll probably turn off my screen so folks can focus on you. So feel free to share, and let's get this party started.
Okay, I'm just going to start my slideshow, and hopefully this all works. Here we go. Does that look good for everyone? You see the actual slide? Okay, great. So yeah, thank you very much, Jeannie, for that introduction. And thank you to Lindsay Evans also for inviting me to be on Secular AZ today. I'm really pleased to be joining you virtually. I'm going to read from an old-fashioned hard copy of the paper while I do the slides. So I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes and present some of the research from the book that was just mentioned, Immigration and Apocalypse, how the book of Revelation shaped American immigration. And then we'll have some time for a Q&A at the end, but please feel free, as questions occur to you, also to put them in the chat so we can see them at the end also, and I'd be happy to discuss with you. I'll be tracing the impact of the biblical book of Revelation on the ways American public discourse described and still continues to describe the arrival of immigrants, particularly in this session, Chinese immigrants and their presence in the United States starting in the 19th century. But you can and you will definitely see how the themes that I discuss connect to American immigration history more broadly, and also to the events that are happening right now in immigration currently. So what I'm going to cover is the beginning of federally enforced systematic exclusion, and it serves ultimately as a blueprint for the things we're seeing today. So you'll make those connections, even as I'm focusing starting in a different century, you'll see all the echoes of that happening right now. So I want you to keep that in mind. But right now, as I begin this lecture, it might seem strange that the book of Revelation should have any impact at all on American political discourse and on racial discourse. So as you might know, the Revelation is the last book of the Christian canon. It's the last book of the New Testament. You might have come across this and you're leafing through the Bible, or you're going to church, or you hear it being read, which isn't very often. It's a very bizarre book, often seen as marginal and sort of embarrassing because of the marginal fringe elements that it has inspired through the centuries. So how is this book connecting to American history, policies, and attitudes of this nation? And what does this ancient Jewish Christian apocalyptic literature have to do with immigration? So I argue that the connections begin as early as the 15th century, so during the age of European exploration and the voyages of Christopher Columbus. So while Columbus was definitely motivated by political power and the possibility of finding riches in a new route to what he thought was the East for trading, he was also driven by a powerful religious belief because he had studied biblical prophecy. And Columbus was convinced that there were two prophecies that had to be fulfilled before the end of the world would come about. He believed that the Christian gospel, first of all, had to reach all peoples at the ends of the earth. That was the first one. And the second, that the holy city of Jerusalem, that was then under Muslim rule on the Mamluk Sultanate, had to be conquered for Christendom with a new crusade. So Columbus believed that he himself would bring these prophecies to pass through his voyages into the West. So he believed that he would reach lands where the gospel had never been. So he would spread the gospel and the Christian religion to those places, especially what he thought was the Garden of Eden, the utter East, when he circled the globe. So he would also at the same time, killing two birds with one stone, find golden treasures enough to fund a new crusade to capture Jerusalem for Christianity. So when these two things he believed had been accomplished, then God's reign would begin and the New Jerusalem, like the heavenly New Jerusalem, the heavenly city, would descend from heaven onto the earth. So Columbus, in fact, wrote in his notebook collection of prophecies that the book of Revelation helped to show him that place where he would find paradise across the sea. So from its very moment of European discovery, the Americas, the land becomes called the New World, were filled with this apocalyptic significance. It was supposed to mark a new era and the beginning of the end, right? An apocalyptic era. So the New World became inextricably tied with thinking about the end of the world and to the heavenly New Jerusalem, God's holy city. And this association with the New Jerusalem that we find in Revelation marked not just the discovery of the New World, but also of America at the time of the colonial settlement of New England, which is where I am located today in Connecticut. So in the 1600s, religious leaders in England who had rejected the English church, the Anglican church, they led their congregations to establish settlements in New England. These Puritans, as they're called, they wanted to establish holy communities and towns and cities in these colonies. And these leaders believed that they were establishing almost literally the New Jerusalem in the New World. They might have thought of this figuratively or poetically, but somehow aspirationally of wanting to manifest this in New England. And John Davenport, who founded the city of New Haven, which is where I live and where Yale University is in Connecticut, actually built the town plan to be like the heavenly city of the New Jerusalem as a 9-square grid, which you'll see on this slide, with the measurements matching those in the Bible in the book of Ezekiel, which Revelation copies a lot of its imagery from. So you have the place of worship at the center in that town green, and you'll see in that center square. So the preparation of America as the place for the New Jerusalem, the city of God, is also reflected in the writings of the Puritans, such as in Cotton Mather's Theopolis Americana, or the American City of God. Mather compares America, and especially New England, to the golden heavenly city of Revelation, and uses this identification to inspire his readers and congregation to live holy lives because he believes that they're God's chosen. And this kind of thinking, that America is chosen by God, led by God, and should be righteous as an example to the rest of the world, also known as American exceptionalism, can be traced throughout United States history. This American exceptionalism is also full of the apocalyptic thinking that we see in Columbus and in the Puritans. That is the understanding that America is a place of destiny and a holy place, and it has to be described in these glorious terms that echo what's being used in Revelation, and especially in descriptions of the New Jerusalem. Revelation's dramatic, triumphant, and radiant imagery and metaphors can be found in descriptions of the Revolutionary War, during the Civil War, and in the expansion westward, where the driving out and killing of indigenous peoples is justified because it is America's heavenly and apocalyptic destiny to establish the New Jerusalem on earth. We could trace the influence of Revelation all the way to the 1980s. And Ronald Reagan's oft-repeated description of the US as a shining city on a hill, a biblical reference that borrows not just from the Gospel of Matthew, but also alludes to Revelation and the identity of America as the New Jerusalem, the shining city that descends from heaven. In fact, in Reagan's speech to the nation in 1989, this is his farewell speech when he's stepping down, he describes America, the shining city, as built on strong foundations, humming with commerce and people of all kinds, with walls but doors that are open for all, with the will and the heart to get there. This is a direct allusion to the description of the New Jerusalem in Revelation chapter 21, where the New Jerusalem is described as being built on 12 foundations, where all the nations and kings of the earth enter bearing riches, where there are walls and the gates never shut. And this narrative of America as the New Jerusalem, both walls and gates, but open gates that welcome in all peoples from the nations, is this all-American story of immigration that portrays the US as a glorious God-chosen destination that is strongly defended with walls and gates, but is also supposedly welcoming to those, as Reagan says, with the will and the heart to get there. The America described in history by politicians and church leaders, newspapers, pundits, they all use Revelation's positive imagery of the New Jerusalem to cast America as a heavenly refuge. But of course, with the book of Revelation, as is the case with most apocalyptic literature, heaven and its glories are not the whole story. The apocalyptic text is also, as you possibly know, full of disaster, violence, judgment, and death. And that's why the popular term apocalyptic means catastrophic, and why we have movies called zombie apocalypses or post-apocalyptic, showing the afterlife of world-ending disasters. And this negative and violent side of Revelation is also a part of American imagination of immigration. So what do I mean by that? I mean that when America, from its discovery to today, is understood and identified as God's city, the New Jerusalem, as a heavenly paradise, using that metaphor also brings with it the dark side of Revelation's story. The New Jerusalem in the Bible does not let everyone in, and the people judged unworthy to enter are thrown into the lake of burning fire. And the city has strong defensive walls, and battles are fought with God's enemies. And these parts of Revelation's story are also a part of the American vocabulary of immigration. It's been very easy for the same politicians and church leaders, pundits and journalists to portray unwanted immigrant groups as the enemies of God's kingdom, describing them in the same way that Revelation describes those outside of the walls of the New Jerusalem. So, for example, in Revelation chapter 22, it says, outside are the dogs and sorcerers and sexually immoral and murderers and idolaters and everyone who loves and practices falsehood. So pay attention to the description of those not allowed to emigrate into the New Jerusalem. You'll find the same strategic descriptions used against immigrant groups throughout American history. People are likened to animals, believed to be religiously bizarre and idolatrous, sexually depraved, violent, and essentially deceptive. And this is the story told throughout US history about Chinese immigrants. And this story has used the images and metaphors from Revelation to exclude them. So the rest of this talk will weave together the history of Chinese immigrants to the US and Revelation's apocalyptic metaphors and descriptions used against them to exclude and discriminate. As I go through these examples, I want you to think of what's happening today, what we see in immigration with the language that's being used, the images that are being used, the kinds of arguments, strategies, and tactics that are being employed in current immigration policies under the Trump administration. So I'm going to begin with a scene from 1870 in the Western United States in Toano, Nevada. Toano lies in an arid desert landscape dotted with sagebrush. It's now a ghost town. It has no structures still standing. But in 1870, it was a town connected by the Central Pacific Railroad to the city of Elko, about 75 miles away. January 5th, 1870 was probably a cold day, but railway workers in Toronto probably preferred the chill considering the cargo they were loading onto a 6-car train headed west to Elko and on to San Francisco. They had to ensure that each car was packed with the remains of dead Chinese railroad workers, packed as full as possible so the Central Pacific Rail could be well paid for the load. According to the newspaper, the Elko Independent, it says, "We understand that the Chinese companies pay the railroad company $10 for carrying to San Francisco each dead Chinaman. 6 cars well stuffed with this kind of freight will be a good day's work." The paper goes on to state, with the same astonishing callousness, the remains of the females are left to rot in shallow graves, while every defunct male is carefully preserved for shipment to the Orient. The western section of the Transcontinental Railroad had reached completion the prior year, 1869, through the labor, mostly of Chinese workers. And the remains of the laborers who had died by sickness or in construction accidents or harsh conditions or by outright murder were collected for shipment back to China. Chinese miners had worked in Nevada's silver mines starting in the 1850s after the California gold rush. But unlike many other immigrants who had arrived to make their home in the US, they were not accepted as able to become Americans or as citizens. In fact, the same year the bodies of Chinese railroad workers were shipped from Nevada to San Francisco, on July 4th, 1870, Congress voted not to allow Chinese immigrants to naturalize. During the Senate debate that preceded the vote, Senator George Williams, a Republican from Oregon, declared that he could not imagine how anyone would want Chinese people to belong to the nation. He said, "Is there anybody who will say that the Chinese is a desirable population?" He said, "Mongolians, no matter how long they may stay in the United States, will never lose their identity as a peculiar and separate people. They will never amalgamate with persons of European descent." Williams, in that statement, captures briefly the racialization of Chinese and later other Asian peoples as perpetual foreigners throughout their history in the US, up to and beyond this writing. So at the end of the 19th century, the Chinese were perceived as the greatest threat by the white residents in the Western states. With the end of the gold rush in California, the closing of mines in Nevada, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, Chinese laborers moved into other areas of work, and their communities continued to expand. While Chinese immigrants had faced discrimination and harassment since their arrival, the shift of Chinese labor away from the railroads, plus the ongoing arrival of Chinese immigrants in California, prompted still greater violence and hate against them. In anti-Chinese speeches before the Senate, opponents of Chinese immigration dwelled on the quote-unquote hordes of Chinese who were flooding into the US, what Senator Thomas Beyer, Democrat of Delaware, called an inundation of countless numbers and of a race wholly different, which would destroy the labor of our people. The Chinese inundation that he speaks of never amounted to more than 1/20th of all immigrants arriving in the United States. Nevertheless, Chinese people were the first racial ethnic group targeted by a nationwide immigration law. The Page Law of 1875 effectively barred Chinese women from entering the United States on the grounds that they were sex workers and morally corrupting. Then the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 restricted the entry of Chinese immigrants by denying entry to Chinese laborers. And while such laws may have calmed the fears of the incoming flood of Chinese workers, it did nothing to protect the Chinese already in the US against violent racist hatred. So Chinese in America had already experienced violence and expulsion from towns through harassment in the 1870s. And the brutality reached a climax in the 1880s, during which Chinese were shot, lynched, and tortured, not only in California, but in Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, and other Western territories. And in 1885, a group of 150 white men in Wyoming killed at least 28 Chinese coal miners, whom they shot, dismembered, and burned alive. In 1887, a gang of white men tortured, mutilated, and murdered at least 34 Chinese miners in Oregon, and no one was ever convicted for this butchery. This hate manifested itself in more legislation in 1884 and 88, which further restricted Chinese entry, and in the Geary Act of 1892, which required all Chinese laborers and later all Chinese in the US to carry proof that they were in the country legally. And this, interesting to note, implemented the first such federal requirement for documentation. So without a certificate, a Chinese laborer could be forced to do hard labor and be deported. They could not post bail or testify as witnesses in a trial. The Geary Act was not repealed until 1943. Chinese entry visas were then still limited in 1943 to 105 per year until 1965. And then in the decades between the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, the Geary Act of 1904, and ever after, there multiplied depictions of Chinese peoples and China as a looming, dangerous, ugly threat in American political speeches, newspapers, literature, and art. The Chinese were transformed into what is called the Yellow Peril. So as in other moments of American crisis and hate, politicians have made use of the book of Revelation to illustrate the situation, flipping the metaphor of America as the New Jerusalem to emphasize the existence of its enemies, God's enemies, and the need for violent exclusion. Yellow peril tropes fit easily into the apocalyptic narratives of Revelation. So at the foundation of apocalyptic yellow peril imagery and stories used to exclude Chinese from entry and acceptance in the United States is the belief that there is a divine, unchangeable difference between white Americans and the Chinese race. And this belief is the core of the speech that I quoted earlier from Senator Bayard in 1882 before the passing of the Chinese Exclusion Act. Bayard argues that opponents of restrictions on Chinese immigration only have money in mind and do not care about the plight of white Americans. And he frames his entire argument in Christian language. He says, those who want to import cheap Chinese laborers overlook or disregard the difference of race. They overlook the difference between Chinese and Christian civilization. But, he argues, a man cannot faithfully serve two contending governments at the same time. Of course, Bayard means the United States and China in the context, but he paraphrases a biblical text that serves his purposes. The text comes from the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. No man can serve two masters. He will either hate the one and love the other, or else he will hold to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So Bayard's implying that his fellow congressmen serve either China, which is the side of money or greed, or the US, the side of God. And the Chinese, in Bayard's view, were a race totally different and separate, and more importantly, unchristian, unable of belonging to the people of God, that is the United States. So Senator Williams argues in that same debate that to welcome in the Chinese was the same as worshiping, he says, ignorance, idolatry, immorality, vice, disease, and prostitution, and sacrificing to these idols the pride and glory of American citizenship. So it's not a coincidence that Williams names ignorance, idolatry, immorality, vice, disease, and prostitution as the gods identified with Chinese and China. These evils have characterized the East in European and American imagination for centuries. And these imagined traits of China and the Chinese play into both their desirous qualities and also a threat in apocalyptic yellow peril vocabulary. So just as the Chinaman can be the useful, exploitable coolie, they can also be the destroying crowd, the horde that's going to invade the United States. So China can be the source of high luxury status goods, silk, tea, or porcelain. And it can also be this decadent, degenerate Babylon of Revelation. It's the enemy and antithesis of the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ. So the whore of Babylon, who represents the city of Rome in the ancient text of Revelation, is described in this lavish, misogynist detail in the biblical text. The text reads, I saw a woman sitting on a scarlet beast that was full of blasphemous names and had 7 heads and 10 horns. And the woman was clothed in purple and scarlet and adorned with gold and jewels and pearls, holding in her hand a golden cup full of abominations and impurities of her prostitution. And on her forehead was written a name, a mystery, Babylon the Great, mother of horrors and of earth's abominations. And I saw that the woman was drunk, and the blood of the saints and the blood of the witnesses to Jesus. And here are all the characterizations of China in the anti-Chinese discourse of the Senate in the 1870s and 80s, which described the Chinese as idolatrous, pagan, decadent, drunken, addicted to opium. They're greedy, they're sexually corrupted and corrupting. They're prostitutes, they're impure, they're filthy. And most threatening of all, like the Whore of Babylon, they consume and conquer Christian peoples, the saints, and the witnesses of Jesus. So while the US senators don't explicitly call China the Whore of Babylon, the likening of China to this apocalyptic figure and the enemies of God's kingdom is clear. And for cartoonists and novelists of the time, the imagery and horror of Revelation provide this resource for anti-Chinese illustrations and literature. So for example, Puritan Dooner's Last Days of the Republic, published in 1880, is the first Yellow Peril novel published in America, and it tells this warning tale of the continued invasion of Chinese people for profit and for the spread of the Chinese population beyond the American West into New England and the South. And the story tells about how the infiltration allows Imperial China to invade the United States slowly until, the author says, the coil of the Asiatic serpent was gradually encircling the entire body of the victim, now virtually within its grasp. Soon, the Chinese armies march across the nation as they finally make their way to Washington, and the novel ends by saying the Republic had fought its last battle, and the imperial dragon of China already floated from the dome of the Capitol. So in this fear-mongering novel, Babylon China wins, demonstrating the consequences of idolatrous worship of money rather than God. And the final image of the dragon flying over the capital is the Qing dynasty flag of China at the time, which features the Chinese long, or dragon. So in Chinese cultural tradition, the long symbolizes power and the emperor and blessing and water and rain generally. But Europeans had by the 19th century equated this long with the demonic dragon and serpent of the Bible and of Revelation in particular. So in Revelation, we have the dragon first appearing in chapter 12. It's a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 diadems on his head. And this is the threatening beast that's going to be defeated ultimately by the army of angels led by the archangel Michael. We read in the text, war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought against the dragon. The dragon and his angels fought back, but they were defeated, and there was no longer any place for them in heaven. The great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. The dragon is ultimately cast into the lake of fire where it is destroyed. And this draconic Satan that European and American imagination equated with the ancient Long of China and Chinese peoples. So, for example, we have a British missionary and diplomat in 1841 accusing Chinese basically of Satan worship because of the use of the symbol of the dragon in their spring festival parades for the new year. So in typical European interpretation, China and Chinese are a satanic kingdom and the enemy of the Christian West. We also have this 1882 novel, A Short and Truthful History of the Taking of California and Oregon by the Chinese in the year AD 1899, which goes even further, making explicit use of Satan and the text of Revelation. So in the novel, Chinese workers spread everywhere and take over the West Coast, led by this mysterious Chinese prince Ca, who sails into the San Francisco Bay inward through the Golden Gate, which is both the Golden Gate Strait of the Bay and an allusion to the Golden Gates of the Heavenly City. The narrator explicitly states that Prince Ca bore less resemblance to a human being than he did to Satan. So the author ends by warning his readers that China will take over the world, and he quotes from the prophecies of Revelation to identify Prince Ca and the threat from the Orient. And the last lines of that novel declare that the black dragon has forced the passage of the Golden Gate. This is the same dragon as Satan China depicted in political cartoons such as The Dragon's Choice, which was in Harper's Weekly in 1900, at the climax of the conflict between the Boxers and the Euro-American alliance. And this image shows this beast standing on the seashore with smoke coming from its mouth, standing over villages on fire. And the dragon is taking its stand. And facing it is Uncle Sam, white-haired, muscular, dressed in sailor whites and adorned with stars, on board a mighty ship, a strong ship with a cannon aimed and ready. So we have on one side what is bestial, raving, dark, satanic China, challenged by the rational, white, and angelic United States. So a few years before this, before The Dragon's Choice, we have Hermann Knackfuss's Yellow Peril, an imagery even more explicitly drawn from Revelation. We have Knackfuss illustration circulating first in Germany and then stateside in Harper's Weekly in 1898. So he is depicting here, on one hand, we have the illustration of a colossal flaming Buddha on the far right-hand side, like the Whore of Babylon. It's seated on a beast, right? The Buddha rides black storm clouds that form a menacing dragon with glowing eyes. And then the perspective of the audience is directed to the European nations, represented by these goddesses and women warriors dressed in this mix of nationalist and Greco-Roman symbols. They stand in the foreground on this cliff under a shining white cross, and leading them is the Archangel Michael, portrayed with typical iconography, with wings, Romanesque armor, and a flaming sword. And he extends an arm in a sweeping gesture toward the battlefield, where he will soon lead them to war, just as he does in Revelation against the great dragon, Satan. So besides being the yellow peril and the demonic threat overtaking the land, Chinese are also labeled as especially diseased and disgusting, a belief that continues to this day in the US as shown by anti-Asian violence and hate during the COVID pandemic. Public discourse linking disease and plague with Chinese immigrants also borrow descriptions and imagery from the Book of Revelation to build up anti-immigrant movements. So for example, this is a pest poison advertisement from the 1880s. In the center is a caricatured Chinaman about to eat a rat while holding another ready in his left hand. And above them reads the slogan, "They must go," referring, of course, to the rats, but also to the Chinaman. The text is an obvious allusion to the political slogan, "The Chinese must go," which was coined by Dennis Kearney of the Working Men's Party of California in 1877. This advertisement uses a common trope for unwanted foreigners, depicting them as eating what is vile, and to identify both the Chinese and the rats as pests, implying that the poison ingested by the rats that then are eaten by the Chinese can work effectively to rid the buyer of both. The Chinaman's braid, the queue, traditional symbol of political significance, sticks out behind the man's head, and its angles and curves mirror the tail of the rat he's about to eat. This is just one of multiple US illustrations portraying the Chinese as a literal pest on the level of rats, mice, bedbugs, flies, and roaches. And in 1877, the San Francisco satirical magazine, The Wasp, ran a cartoon called Uncle Sam's Farm in Danger. This cartoon participated in the fear-mongering against Chinese refugees fleeing the northern Chinese famine of 1876 to 79. In it, Chinese immigrants are a literal pest, embodying a plague. They are a swarm of consuming grasshoppers. They're depicted as a biblical plague of locusts, particularly the plague described in Revelation chapter 9, which covers the earth after the fifth trumpet of God is blown. So like the apocalyptic locusts, the Chinese insects have faces like human faces, and their braids are described in Revelation as women's hair, as long braids. And they have also what resembles tails like scorpions with stingers. And these braids stick straight out of their backs of their heads like insects' appendages. And further linking their cartoon to the apocalyptic imagery of Revelation is the demonic figure of famine, driving the grasshoppers on with a cord of whips. Famine and the grasshoppers appear in this shade of green, and this is the color of the fourth horse in the apocalypse, which death rides over the earth to kill with, we're told, sword, famine, and pestilence, and by the wild animals of the earth. So only a single simple farm fence stands in the way of the horde of Chinese locusts, a sign of weakness at the US border and of US immigration policy. So in the apocalyptically diseased American imagination, the Chinese embody the horrors of Revelation visited upon the earth. The New York Daily Tribune described Chinese peoples in 1854 as unclean, filthy beyond all conception, claiming that the Chinese quarter of the city of San Francisco is a byword for filth and sin. And the California State Board of Health pronounced in 1862 that Chinese entry into the US would cause national decay, and declared in 1871 that intermingling with a sensual and depraved people would guarantee the passing of hereditary vices. Public discourses blame Chinese for disease and sickness, relying on these perceptions of foreignness linked with degradation and plague. In 1860s and 70s and 80s, San Francisco suffered several smallpox epidemics, and hysteria grew as medical officials claimed it was an essentially Chinese disease. So here's another image in 1883 of San Francisco's Three Graces. The cartoon depicts malaria, smallpox, and leprosy as these ghostly figures looming over the city of San Francisco, with a ship that's carrying immigrants on the bottom left-hand corner, arriving at port. And we have leprosy, the Chinese disease, lingering over Chinatown. And it's a caricatured Chinaman with, again, the braid, the queue. And from his left hand flows something labeled white called Chinatown. This might be a disease pouring out onto the filthy quarters of Chinatown, or it could be also a piece of laundry, because Chinese were known to be those who are running the laundries of the city and across communities in the West. And this was also part of the accusation that they were using these laundries to spread disease, including consumption, syphilis, or skin diseases. So for Chinese living in the US, their identification by white societies as diseased, pestilent, and corrupting meant constant surveilling and policing of their homes and businesses, accompanied by the threat of invasion, fumigation, unsafe quarantine, isolation, removal from one's homes into segregated hospital quarters, and of course, deportation. So there were multiple health inspections being run. And finally, the detention center was built on Angel Island to screen arrivals from the East coming to San Francisco Port, where they were held and subjected to invasive medical inspections that were never part of the routine at Ellis Island, the port on the East Coast. So then the Chinese body, the Asian body, and all unwanted bodies eventually had to be kept from entering the United States. And they're identified not just as carriers of parasites, but also indistinguishable from pest and disease. So they become part of the identity, the very essential characteristic of races that white nativists in the United States want to exclude. And these are also key characteristics of those who are damned for destruction in the book of Revelation, in which waters turn to poison and blood, and idolaters do not wash their robes, or they live in nakedness, or dress in degenerate scarlet and purple, and the sinful suffer from painful sores, or degrade their bodies with sexual immorality. So the New Jerusalem of Revelation and its citizens present the opposite of these unwanted characteristics, right? The city flows the pristine river of life. We have the holy citizens of the New Jerusalem and the angels of God and the Son of Man. They wear clean, washed white robes, and their bodies are pure of sexual corruption and are holy and healed by the fruit of the trees of life growing along the river. So that American anti-immigration discourse should use the same elements as Revelation to describe itself as pristine and the unwanted as filthy is not just a coincidence. The long, persistent use of the New Jerusalem to imagine America had incorporated into immigration discourse the vocabulary of purity, filth, health, and disease in distinctly Christian modes. And we find this when we analyze the mission stories of Chinese conversion to Christianity, in which individuals can become qualified for inclusion in America. So we have the conversion of the person and the individual to Protestant Christianity that go hand in hand with markers of cleanliness that we find in Revelation. So for example, one woman who was converted by a white missionary, Chinese woman in 1900, was taken from Chinatown and described in a new home that's described as full of God's love, pure air, and sunshine. Her curtains are snowy white, and she's doing her laundry when they visit, washing her robes like they do in Revelation 12 or 22 that says, "Blessed are those who wash their robes, that they will have the right to the tree of life that may enter the city by the gates." But for Chinese immigrants wanting to enter the gates of America, the country could also be seen as a heavenly destination. And it's described by such as a Chinese immigrant named Yii Jan coming in 1868. He says, when he's arriving at San Francisco Bay, to be actually at the Golden Gate of the land of our dreams, the feeling that welled up in us was indescribable. I wonder whether the ecstasy before the pearly gates of the celestial city above could surpass what we felt at that moment we realized that we had reached our destination. So Gene is writing this at the end of his life when he had been baptized at the age of 20 and went on to serve the Chinese Christian community in New York City. So his description of his first arrival in America is with Christian language, using the dominant metaphor of America as the New Jerusalem. But those initial hopes of seeing the shores of the celestial city are dashed when he realizes he's encountering the violent, fearful reality faced by Chinese immigrants of the 1870s and 80s. He says, the useful and steady Chinese worker became overnight the mysterious Chinaman, an object of dread. So instead of entering the heavenly city, the Chinese are abandoned to the flames. His recollections are of terrible persecution of Chinese. He says they were long processions at night with big torchlights and lanterns carrying the slogan, the Chinese must go, and mass meetings where fiery tongues flayed the Chinese bogey. And he recollects the anti-Chinese agitator, Dennis Kearney, calling for Chinese to be hurled into damnation, saying there's no means left to clear the Chinaman, but to swing them into eternity by their own braids. There's no rope long enough in all America wherewith to strangle 400 millions of Chinamen. He says, we were terrified. This is what Gene says. We kept indoors after dark for fear of being shot in the back. Children spit upon us as we passed by and called us rats. So the rejection, interrogation, inspection, and humiliation of those seeking entry to America stand in sharp contrast to the promise of paradise and Reagan's open doors for those with the will and the heart to enter. This doesn't mean that America failed as the New Jerusalem, but that the metaphor was realized completely, both the good side and the destructive, catastrophic side. And this continues to be true today in order to serve the political interests of those using it in immigration discourse. America as the New Jerusalem, with its gleaming walls and foundations set as a shining city on a hill, presents a fresh beginning, moral aspirations, promises of wealth, promises of safety and of stability. But implicit in the purity of those city walls is the exclusion of the impure outside, the dogs and sorcerers and fornicators and murderers and idolaters. That is the language the American government is still using against immigrants today, speaking of invasions by enemies, likening immigrants to animals, describing them as godless and violent in order to justify their deportation and extermination. In this moment of authoritarian government by executive order, especially with the support of Christian nationalist intent on Christian dominion, the extreme language of the apocalypse is again working in the United States. Thank you so much for listening. I look forward to our discussion.
Wow. Like just the chat, and I'm glad that you weren't, hopefully you weren't really paying attention to the chat because it was such a great presentation. I swear we always learn so much on these Fridays. It's, okay, here in Arizona, a couple of years ago, he's no longer in our state legislature, but we had a senator, a representative, I can't even remember what he was when he left, but he would talk about how he wanted to bring Arizona back to like 1958 or something, and at that time it was, I think it was more of a reference to, the Black Lives Matter protests and things like that. But, it just shows us that this kind of stuff has been happening in the United States since our inception. And there's a very, when he said, when folks say they want to make America great again, right? We know we know which Americans they're talking about. Really, there's a really great question here coming from Phil. So again, and so much just positive feedback in the chat.
Thank you. Yeah.
Yeah. But Phil says, do we have any idea how many Americans today associate Asian immigrants with the Book of Revelation as you have described in your presentation? Are there people today who specifically point to immigration, especially that of Asians, as a sign that what is written in Revelation is being fulfilled? Great question.
Yeah, thank you. So, I mean, the first thing I think of with specifically pointing to Asians is during COVID, right? So, if you look up, you can just Google prophecy and COVID, and you will come up with all sorts of, for or against, whether this is part of biblical prophecy or not. And there's some voices that I would say are more sane and rational about talking about this. And there are those who are definitely saying, this is the end or this is the beginning of the end. And then you'll find depictions. I wouldn't say necessarily that people will specifically quote Revelation, but the imagery that's being used. So one popular image is of a dragon who is eating a bowl full of, random things, the animals that you wouldn't associate with food, right? Because of the whole discussion of whether this came from Wuhan and from the wet markets of the animals. So there is the continued thread, right, of eating animals that we see as abominable, right, socially constructed as such, and blaming this practice on those horrible, disgusting immigrants, whether it's Chinese or, of course, you'll think of J.D. Vance and Donald Trump during the debates and saying the Haitians are eating the dogs and cats, right? So it's a very consistent theme of that rhetoric of disgust to talk about what people we want to other by saying they don't eat the same things, their health and hygiene practices are not the same. And this underlying rationale of, health and hygiene and purity, ultimately, right, linked to a purity of blood, linked to purity of skin, right, and all of those things. And so yeah, exactly, not like us, totally disgusting. And so the more you can distance an identity from you, the easier it is to say, we need to deport, we need to be violent, we can, do these things. So I would say, maybe not, explicit quoting scripture chapter and verse, but those cluster of metaphors continues to work really well for those politicians in describing things in a particular way. And I would say certainly Asians and especially that perpetual foreign trope, as China becomes a greater power, and it is a greater power and seen as a threat on all sorts of levels, and it's a threat amongst Asian countries as well, don't mistake me. But the conflation, the equation of Asian peoples and Chinese American peoples that are citizens of the US with a political enemy, I think is frightening, right? And that will happen across all sorts, but especially with those that you can pick out immediately through physical characteristics, right? So that's one thing that's happening. But then the othering also follows different blue points because it's a different history of racialization for Latinos, for Black Americans. There's like different ways those get constructed, but the similar vocabulary that gets used over and over again and recycled.
So one thing I will admit that as far as like, and I minored in history during my undergrad, but I tended to focus more on like African American history. I just gravitated towards that because in my K-12 education I got zero
Yeah.
education about that, and so it just happened kind of naturally. But I did, I took a few classes here and there about China and Chinese culture, but I didn't really realize, I didn't know a lot of what you were talking about. Like, I mean, I think that when I think of those old tropes of Chinese immigrants, like I think of, maybe like opium dens and, obviously like railroad. I grew up, I'm ashamed, but I mean, I did grow up watching like Little House on the Prairie. So we had like depictions of
All
more
right, right,
compassion,
yeah.
more compassionate, I guess I would say, depictions of Chinese people, Chinese Americans in pop culture, but still probably not completely correct. But you mentioned too, like, how women were perceived as being like prostitutes and dirty and whatnot. And and I just think of like there is like this fetishization, right, of
Yeah.
of Asian women in particular. You see it if you glance at a Reddit post or something like that,
Yeah.
right? And I want like, did that stem from this kind of otherization, that these the stereotypes of people coming from other, is it just me?
No, for sure. I mean, that is definitely part of the racialization of Asian women and Chinese women, even from before, right, in the 20th century. So we do have um, and I mean, exoticization of women all across the global South.
Right.
But it's not just, partly is from, the wanting to create a threat, right? To say we cannot have this particular population come in. I would also say it's strategic. When you want laborers, so for example, if you want part of Bracero's program to have people coming in from Mexico, or you have people coming in to build the railroads from China, you don't want those communities to grow. So one very effective way to do that is to not allow their same race of women to come, because there are anti-miscegenation laws in place. So you cannot intermarry with white people. If you cannot intermarry and there's no allowance for any of the women of your ethnic background to come, those communities will die because you only have male laborers. And so that's one immigration policy that's very strategic in limiting community growth, right? But on top of that, you also have just the exoticization, and the presence of US military in Asia will also create, right, the need for prostitution, comfort women, et cetera, in those. So there's a whole history of US sexualization of Asian women that we also see bearing fruit in the shootings in Atlanta and the Asian massage parlors in 2021, right? So like, it's just part and parcel of a whole nexus of things that are happening in history. And of course, there's different depictions of women of color and Black women throughout US history in various racialized ways, also to say, they have too many children, or they're threatening, or, disease prone, syphilitic as their prostitutes. So it spans the spectrum.
Yeah. There's a question here coming from Jennifer. She says, does this connect to the white savior trope and white missionaries going to different countries to convert and adopt children? Yeah, that's a great question.
There's a whole study on adoption, and especially global adoption, that I don't specialize in, so I don't want to speak out of turn. But I'm sure there's themes to be traced there. I do think missionary work, I don't want to discount the aid and practical help that mission work can sometimes do. At the same time, it is also a tool of colonization very often, right? And so it's oftentimes linked and justifying colonizing political movement to say these people need to be saved, their souls need to be saved. And so our presence is justified because we're doing these things, right? And so, I think that's how I would see a lot of mission work in that particular way, taken on by Europe and Americans at the time.
Yeah, it's definitely a trope, to be sure. And let me just go up here real quick to see if I missed anything. Yes, it also shows us that xenophobia is not a new thing for the US, but rather an evolving virus. What a great way of putting it. That's our development director, Eddie, with that comment. Corey says, these presentations are always so compelling and thought-provoking, and this one was definitely top tier. Thank you so much. So again, lots of positive feedback here. I think I've gotten most of the question. Oh, Diane, our legal director, says Nazis took their eugenics ideas from us, who were sterilizing minorities and disabled people. Fannie Lou Hamer was involuntarily given a Mississippi appendectomy, i.e. sterilization. But, that's an and I don't know if this is where your research takes you, but like, is that something that happened to, Chinese immigrants or other Asian immigrants the same way that it did for Black women in America?
Not in terms of sterilization. I don't want to say there are no, but I don't know offhand of any cases. I do know in terms of, so for example, the link between US immigration and Nazi practices. There's a section in the book where I talk about Mexican day laborers crossing the border, and they had to, and this is hilarious and horrible, they had to get a bath ticket, like to show that they had been bathed. So it's literally like entering the New Jerusalem. You have to wash your robes. They had to hand over their clothes. And then what's horrible about it is they're doused with stuff. Sometimes it was kerosene for typhoid and lice, which is terribly unsafe. And there was a giant fire. I have a picture in the book of somebody being sprayed with Cyclone B, which is a pesticide that's linked to the gases that they're using in the Holocaust. And so the idea that you are not clean or pure enough to enter right into the US unless we are doing these things to you. And so definitely linked to that whole, and eugenics, it's interesting to think of writ large, immigration policy is to choose the population of a nation, right? And so if you want to see it as like non-medical, large-scale, federally enforced eugenics, in a sense, right, of saying we want the makeup, the stock, which is the old-fashioned way of talking about the genetic pool, right, of the people who are living in the United States. What do you want? What is the base identity that you want it to be? And it's very clear in what's happening right now of who qualifies and who doesn't qualify.
Ugh, God.
Yeah.
All it makes me think about too is like, when you think about the history of the entire universe, we're here for such a short period of time. Like, I just wish that we would make the choice to do good.
Right.
We're
Yeah.
here for such a
Don't we have better, greater, more beautiful things to do? Like, yeah.
right.
Yeah.
I'd love to focus on the greater, more beautiful things in this
Yeah.
world. All right, here's another question coming in from Mona. First of all, she says, great presentation. One question is, how did these tropes also morph into the model minority trope? Or was this a reaction from Chinese people to assimilate to be safe? Great question.
That is a great question. I mean, there are whole books written on the model minority myth. Um, I mean, ultimately, I would say model minority is a tool of white supremacy to say, hey, you are white adjacent, right? And so, as an Asian population, you can achieve, right? There is the myth of meritocracy in the United States of like, you can do whatever. And if the closer you come to us, right, the better you are. And it turns what could be coalition against each other. And we definitely see that playing out in affirmative action suits where you have Asian Americans totally fighting against Black American identities in the United States, which is heartbreaking to watch as someone who wants there to be better coalition. But it's the tool, I would say, of white supremacy. The origins of model minority are in part, I mean, it is a belief in the American dream. I mean, it's a complicated history. But the understanding of what's achievable in the US and how to do that. We also have the long legacy of Japanese internment and how that changes how you think about assimilation. So I'll have Japanese friends who will say they were told never to speak anything but English, right? And so to assimilate as quickly as possible to not seem like the enemy. So on a very practical, basic level, right, to fit in, even though you're marked as foreign, very ironically. So different ways of maneuvering how to exist in the United States. And that has become one of the legacies of that.
Mm-hmm. Corey says, I want to see what happens when we stop interfering and just let society evolve however it does, let the program run, so to speak. I think they mean convert and become white and delightful. I think that's what they mean to say, which is essentially, I guess, what the US government has asked people to do since,
Right.
Since 1776, essentially,
Yeah,
right? Or even before that, let's be honest. Yeah.
Yeah, right.
And another compliment coming from Jen. This is so informative. Thank you so much. That's a reference to LDS theology, white and delightsome.
White and delightsome.
I did not know that. White and delightsome apparently is what they say. So interesting. And Lindsay says, unfortunately, I know this. She wasn't even raised Mormon, so it's kind of funny that she knows that.
The Latter-day Saints also have this apocalyptic vision of the United States too, in creating a very particular community. Another branch I don't explore as much in the book, but it's definitely there, of taking revelation in a particular way and seeing chosenness also in a particular way. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I'll tell you what, nothing but kudos here in the
Thank
chat. This
you.
has been and Phil says, thank you for your very informative and thought-provoking presentation, Doctor. And so I'm just going to, this is how I usually end because you know, in today's timeline, it's sometimes a little bit time to find or hard to find hope in these times. So I try to close with the question of all of our guests of what gives you hope in such trying times?
This is okay. So one thing I think of, two things. First is all of this is very recent, right? Like when I talk about the first time we have documentation of the Geary Act in 1892, that's not that long ago. We didn't even need passports for certain things. So like this isn't necessary. And if we can remember that, that can help us think about new and more creative ways of thinking about borders, crossing borders, who belongs, who doesn't. None of this is necessary, right? It's not part of the human condition. The other thing is that communities have lived through apocalyptic times before. So if they have survived, and I think particularly of African Americans living in the United States, from chattel slavery through the Civil War to emancipation, restoration, terrible Jim Crow laws, et cetera, like those are waves of apocalyptic happenings, and there is a tenacious survival possible. So it seems like cold comfort that this has happened and it's always been disastrous, but in some ways, you just keep on, right? So there is a way of putting it in perspective and zooming out because it seems so absurdly dystopian, but it has been, right? So like to acknowledge that and think of if those who came before us continued and survived, then we have to do that too, as part of that discipline of hope, I think.
Yes, I love that. It reminds me, we had another guest. Oh gosh, I hope I don't get her name wrong, but I think it's Mandisa Dennis, and she's a constitutional scholar, and she talks about how we need to ground like every decision that comes up. Madiba Denny, thank you. I knew I wouldn't get it right. Madiba Denny, but she talks about how, you know, if we need to ground every single decision coming out of the Supreme Court in the Reconstruction era
Yes.
amendments, because that is the first time
Yep.
in our nation's country or in our nation's history that Black folks had rights. You know, we're seen as individuals, as citizens, and so like when all of us start clutching our pearls and wringing our hands over what's going on right now, perhaps maybe we need to look at our privilege and consider, you know, what has happened in our country's history through a different
Yeah.
lens,
Yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah.
So Dr. Lin, this has been one of my, I say this all the time, but that's just because Lindsay gets such great guests. Thank you so much. This was so informative in an area of history that I am woefully undereducated about. So I look forward to getting your book. Okay, you said none of this is necessary. Sorry, but Corey says, Jeannie, we need to put that quote on a shirt because I said what you said. None of this is necessary, Dr. Lin. So maybe some merch in your future.
I like that. Thank you so much for having me here.
Thank you so much and have a great weekend, everybody. Take care.